It had been 6 months since Ethan Caldwell's life had taken an unexpected turn. 6 months since the divorce papers had been signed and his life, once a picture-perfect fairy tale, had turned into a series of empty days filled with meetings, meaningless relationships, and the shallow echoes of his success. Ethan Caldwell wasn't just anyone. He was the Ethan Caldwell, a millionaire at 35, founder of a wildly successful real estate empire, and a man whose name still turned heads in the right circles. Yet for all his wealth, power, and new freedom, Ethan couldn't shake the emptiness that followed him like a shadow. He masked it well, though, like tonight. The restaurant was one of the finest in the city, a sleek, upscale establishment where reservations were impossible unless you were someone important. Ethan sat at his usual table, positioned just far enough from the center to avoid unnecessary attention. Across from him, his new girlfriend, Madison, a striking blonde with perfect features and a calculated laugh, browsed the wine list. "You'll love this place," he said smoothly, swirling his own glass of Bordeaux. "They're famous for their steaks. Best in the state." Madison looked up, smiling as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Of course you'd know that. You've probably brought every girlfriend here, haven't you?" Ethan smirked. She wasn't wrong, though he didn't answer. Madison wasn't much different from the others he'd dated recently. Beautiful, agreeable, and interested in the lifestyle that came with being on Ethan Caldwell's arm. That's all he needed now. Or so he told himself. The evening seemed routine at first. Another dinner. Another night of shallow conversation. But just as Ethan leaned back in his chair to scan the room, his gaze froze on a figure at the far end of the restaurant. She was hard to miss. A woman in a simple uniform, black pants, a white shirt, and an apron tied neatly around her waist. She carried a tray of drinks, moving quickly from table to table. She looked tired, her face slightly pale, her movements slower than the other waitstaff. And yet, Ethan recognized her instantly. His heart stopped. It couldn't be. "Ethan?" Madison's voice snapped him back to the moment. "Are you okay? You're staring." Ethan blinked, his face suddenly pale. I thought I saw someone I know." He glanced back again, unable to help himself. It was her. There was no mistaking it. Sophia, his ex-wife. The last time he'd seen her, she had been furious, throwing her wedding ring at him across their sprawling living room. That day had been the final nail in the coffin of their 6-year marriage. But now she was here, working. And then Ethan noticed something else, something that punched the air from his lungs. Sophia was pregnant. 7 months, at least. The tray in her hand trembled slightly as she placed drinks on a table. She took a deep breath and forced a smile before moving on, but Ethan saw the exhaustion in her every step. She didn't belong here. Not in this restaurant, not serving him and people like him. "Who are you looking at?" Madison's voice cut in again, sharp with curiosity. "No one," Ethan muttered, but his voice betrayed him. He couldn't tear his eyes away. Questions swarmed his mind, each one louder than the last. Why is she working here? Who is the father? What happened to her? Before he could think twice, Ethan pushed his chair back abruptly, the screech of the legs against the marble floor making Madison flinch. "I'll be right back." "Ethan," she called after him, confused. He didn't answer. His steps carried him across the dining room, weaving between tables until he found himself near the kitchen door where Sophia had disappeared. A waiter noticed him hovering and frowned. "Sir, this area is for staff only." "I need to speak with someone," Ethan said sharply, his voice carrying the authority that came so naturally to him. "Sophia, the woman who was just serving." The waiter blinked, confused. "Sophia? I don't." Before he could finish, the door swung open, and there she was. Sophia. She froze when she saw him, the tray in her hands tilting slightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them seemed to fall away. The clinking of glasses, the chatter of diners, all of it disappeared. "Sophia," Ethan said finally, his voice low. Her eyes narrowed, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" "I could ask you the same thing," he shot back, though his tone softened as he glanced down at her swollen stomach. "You're pregnant?" Sophia's jaw tightened, and she glanced around nervously. This isn't the place for this conversation. Go back to your table, Ethan. You don't belong here. I don't belong here? Ethan repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. Sophia, you're working as a waitress. You don't belong here. Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, Ethan saw the same fire in her that he had fallen in love with all those years ago. You don't know anything about me, Ethan. Not anymore. Before he could respond, another server called her name, motioning her toward a nearby table. Sophia turned her back on him and disappeared into the dining room, leaving Ethan standing there with more questions than answers. He didn't return to his table right away. Instead, he lingered by the door, watching her from a distance. Watching as she worked, smiled politely at customers, and carried tray after tray with hands that looked far too delicate for this kind of labor. Ethan's mind raced. 6 months ago, he thought he'd closed the chapter on Sophia for good. But now, seeing her like this, pregnant, working herself to the bone, he realized the story was far from over, and he couldn't walk away without knowing the truth. Ethan returned to his table, his mind spinning, but Madison noticed his distraction immediately. What was that about? She asked, her perfectly manicured hand tapping her wine glass impatiently. Nothing, he muttered, sitting down, though his eyes darted back to the dining room. Madison leaned forward, her voice sharp. Ethan, don't lie to me. Who is she? He didn't answer, but deep down, he was asking himself the same question. How had Sophia ended up here, working as a waitress, pregnant, when 6 months ago, she was living comfortably in their home? She wasn't supposed to struggle. He had made sure of that. The divorce settlement had been generous, and Sophia wasn't someone who wasted money. Unable to sit still, Ethan caught the eye of the restaurant manager and waved him over. The man approached quickly, a polite but wary smile on his face. How can I help you, sir? The woman serving tables, Sophia, Ethan said, his voice firm. How long has she been working here? The manager hesitated. Sophia? Oh, a few months, I believe. She's a hard worker, always on time. Why? Ethan frowned. Does she have someone helping her? The manager looked confused. Helping her? No, she's on her own as far as I know. But, thanks, Ethan said abruptly, waving the man off. He could feel Madison glaring at him, but he didn't care. On her own. That was all he needed to hear. Ethan spent the rest of the evening in a haze, barely acknowledging Madison's attempts to restart their conversation. When dinner was over, he didn't wait for Sophia to reappear. Instead, he left a fat tip on the table, stood, and made his way toward the exit. But just as he stepped outside into the crisp night air, he saw her. Sophia, standing near the staff entrance at the side of the building, her hands resting on her lower back as she stretched. She looked exhausted, her posture slouched, but her face held a quiet determination that stopped Ethan in his tracks. Without thinking, he walked toward her. Sophia. She flinched, turning sharply. Ethan? Her voice was defensive. Why are you following me? I'm not following you, he replied, though even he didn't believe that. I saw you. In there. Congratulations, she said flatly, crossing her arms. You found out I'm a waitress. What do you want, Ethan? He hesitated, trying to piece his thoughts together. How did it come to this? You're pregnant, Sophia. You shouldn't be working yourself like this. Sophia's expression hardened. I don't need your pity. My life isn't your business anymore. You're carrying a child, he pressed. Whose? She cut him off with a glare. Don't you dare. Don't you dare ask me that question. Ethan froze. There was something in her tone, something raw and painful, that made his chest tighten. I just want to help you. Sophia laughed bitterly. Help me? You want to help me? You walked out of my life, Ethan. You decided I wasn't good enough for you anymore. And now, because you see me struggling, you want to feel better about yourself by throwing a few bills my way? No, I don't want your help. Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. That's not fair, Sophia. I didn't leave because you weren't good enough. You know that. She shook her head, a tear escaping down her cheek despite her best efforts to hold it back. It doesn't matter anymore. Before he could say another word, Sophia turned and walked away, disappearing through the staff entrance and leaving Ethan standing alone in the cold. He stared after her for a long time, his heart pounding. For the first time in months, the pieces of his perfect, controlled world felt like they were falling apart. And deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Ethan couldn't get Sophia out of his head. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the city skyline, her words echoed in his mind. You walked out of my life. You decided I wasn't good enough. He knew it wasn't that simple. Their marriage hadn't fallen apart because of one fight, one decision. It had crumbled under the weight of years of distance, arguments, and Ethan's obsession with his business. The more success he gained, the further away he drifted from her. But what haunted him most was the child. Her child. Whose was it? Why hadn't she told him? And why was she working in a place like that when he had left her enough to live comfortably? Sleep didn't come. By dawn, Ethan had made up his mind. He needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. The next day, Ethan stood outside the same restaurant where he had seen Sophia the night before. The morning rush was starting, and employees were streaming in through the back entrance. He spotted her immediately, carrying a worn-out bag and walking slowly, her pregnancy clearly taking its toll. Ethan stepped forward, calling out, "Sophia." She stopped and turned, her face falling the moment she saw him. "Are you serious, Ethan? What are you doing here?" "I just want to talk," he said, holding up his hands in surrender. "Please." Sophia sighed heavily, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "You have 2 minutes. That's all I need." Ethan took a deep breath, his voice softer now. "Why are you working here? After the divorce, I made sure you were taken care of." Sophia's expression twisted into something unreadable. "Taken care of? You think money fixes everything?" Ethan frowned. "It was never about money, Sophia. She cut him off, her voice rising. "I didn't want your money, Ethan. I wanted my life back. I wanted my dignity. But after you walked away, everyone else did too. Friends. Family. It's like I disappeared. So I started over. I've been doing just fine on my own." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Fine? You're 7 months pregnant, Sophia, working on your feet for hours. That's not fine." For a brief moment, her face softened, but she quickly turned away, her shoulders slumping. "You don't get to care anymore." "Who's the father?" Ethan asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia froze, her back still to him. She didn't answer right away, and when she finally turned, there was something distant in her eyes. "It doesn't matter." "It does to me," he pressed. "Sophia, if it's not your child, Ethan," she said sharply, her voice cracking. "So stop pretending you care." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but she shook her head. "Go home, Ethan. Go back to your perfect life. Whatever you're looking for, you won't find it here." With that, Sophia turned and disappeared into the building, leaving him standing alone again. The drive back to his office was a blur. Ethan couldn't stop replaying the conversation. "It's not your child." Her words lingered like poison, but something didn't add up. Sophia had always been honest, even when it hurt. There was something in the way she said it, a hesitation, a crack in her voice, that told him there was more to the story. When he arrived at his office, his assistant, Jenna, was waiting for him. "Mr. Caldwell, you have meetings scheduled all afternoon. Are you okay?" Ethan waved her off. "Cancel everything." "Everything?" Jenna asked, blinking in surprise. "Yes. And find out everything you can about Sophia Richardson. Where she's been living, who she's been seeing, everything." Jenna hesitated. "Sir, is this about the divorce?" "It's about something I should have handled a long time ago," Ethan said quietly. Hours later, Jenna returned with a thin folder and placed it on his desk. "This is everything I could find. It's not much. She's been living in a small apartment on the other side of town. No known relatives nearby. She's been working double shifts at that restaurant for months." Ethan flipped through the folder, his heart sinking. Sophia's address was a far cry from the life she used to have. A cheap, run-down apartment building in a forgotten corner of the city. He saw the rent amount, barely enough to scrape by. And then something caught his eye. A hospital record from 2 months ago. Ethan's hands froze as he read the line. Emergency visit. Patient, Sophia Richardson. Condition, pregnancy complications, stress-related. His stomach twisted. Stress-related. Was she pushing herself to the point of collapse? And where was the child's father in all of this? Ethan slammed the folder shut and stood up, his jaw set. He didn't care if Sophia didn't want his help. He wasn't going to sit back and watch her destroy herself. What he didn't know was that the answers he was chasing were far darker than he imagined. Ethan stood outside Sophia's apartment building later that evening, staring at the peeling paint and cracked windows. It didn't make sense. How had she gone from a life of comfort to this? Why had she let it happen? He knocked on the door to her unit, number 12. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, it creaked open. Sophia stood there, wearing an oversized sweater and looking utterly drained. Ethan, what are you doing here? I needed to see for myself, he said, glancing around. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished. A worn couch, a couple of mismatched chairs, and a baby crib still in its box. You shouldn't be here, she muttered. But Ethan stepped inside before she could close the door. Why didn't you tell me you were struggling? His voice was calmer now, but firm. Sophia turned away, her shoulders slumped. Because it's my life, Ethan, not yours. I don't need your pity, and I don't want your help. Ethan looked around again, his chest tightening at the sight of unpaid bills stacked on the counter. You're pregnant, Sophia. You can't do this alone. She spun to face him, her voice shaking. I am doing it alone. You gave up that right when you walked away. Ethan's gaze hardened. And what about the father? Where is he in all of this? Sophia didn't answer. She simply turned her back, her silence louder than any words. For the first time, Ethan felt a crack of dread. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she was hiding, and he wasn't leaving until he found out what it was. Sophia's silence lingered in the small apartment, thick and unrelenting. Ethan stood frozen, watching her as she ran her hand over her stomach. A protective instinct she didn't even seem aware of. Where's the father, Sophia? Ethan pressed again, his voice quieter this time. Her back was to him, but her shoulders tensed. It's none of your business. It is my business if you're hurting like this, he shot back, his frustration bubbling to the surface. You're carrying a child alone. Who left you like this? Who let you work yourself into the ground? Sophia whipped around, her face etched with anger. Stop, Ethan. You think you know everything, don't you? You think you can walk back into my life and fix it all because you feel guilty. But this isn't about you. Then tell me what it's about, Ethan demanded. Sophia's lips trembled as she stared at him, something breaking behind her eyes. The father isn't here because he doesn't know, and he doesn't deserve to know. Ethan blinked, stunned. What does that mean? Sophia sat down heavily on the couch, covering her face with her hands. Because it's you, Ethan. The words hit him like a freight train. The room spun for a moment as he tried to process what she had just said. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Sophia looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. The baby, it's yours. Ethan felt his chest tighten. You told me. I lied, she interrupted softly. When we divorced, I found out I was pregnant, but I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want you to think I was trying to trap you or keep you in a marriage you didn't want. So I left. I tried to do this on my own. Ethan sank onto the arm of the chair, his heart pounding. The baby is mine. The words repeated in his mind over and over. You let me believe it wasn't, he said, his voice low. Sophia wiped her face, her tone filled with defeat. Because I knew you wouldn't want this, Ethan. You were so ready to leave, ready to move on. How could I ask you to stay for a child when you didn't want me? Ethan's stomach turned. He had been blind, focused on his career, on his frustrations, on what he thought he needed. And all this time, Sophia had been carrying his child, struggling alone. He stood up abruptly. I'm not leaving this time, Sophia. Not you, and not this baby. Sophia looked up at him, disbelief in her eyes. It's too late for that, Ethan. No, he said firmly, his voice steady now. It's not. I won't walk away again. For the first time, Sophia didn't argue. She just stared at him, her silence leaving more questions than answers. But Ethan knew one thing. The truth had finally come out, and now there was no turning back. The air felt heavy in Sophia's tiny apartment as Ethan stood, still reeling from her confession. The baby is mine. Those 4 words echoed in his head, loud and relentless. He had thought he'd come for answers, but nothing had prepared him for this. Sophia sat quietly on the couch, her hands resting protectively on her stomach, her face etched with exhaustion. She finally broke the silence. You don't get to say things like that, Ethan. Not after everything. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm but insistent. I didn't know, Sophia. You never gave me a chance. Her head shot up, anger flashing in her eyes. A chance? You left me. You didn't care enough to fight for our marriage. For me? You didn't want a family. You wanted freedom. How was I supposed to believe you'd want this baby? Ethan flinched at her words, the weight of his past decisions pressing down on him. You're right. I wasn't there for you. I was selfish. But I didn't know you were pregnant. If I had, it doesn't matter anymore. Sophia cut in sharply, her voice trembling. You can't change what happened. Ethan knelt in front of her, his eyes searching hers. Maybe I can't change the past, but I can fix this. I can be here now, for you, and for our child. Sophia stared at him, torn between disbelief and something else. Hope. Maybe, though she tried to hide it. And what? You'll throw some money at the problem? Pay for everything, so you can feel better about yourself? Ethan shook his head firmly. No, I don't want to write a check and walk away. I want to be a father. I want to be in this baby's life. And I want to help you, Sophia, whether you believe me or not. Her expression softened, but she looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can trust you again. Then let me earn it, Ethan replied. Let me prove to you that I mean it this time. Sophia didn't answer, but she didn't tell him to leave either. For Ethan, that was enough, for now. Over the next few days, Ethan kept his promise. He started small. Groceries appeared on Sophia's doorstep, bills she hadn't been able to pay mysteriously vanished, and the crib that had sat in a box for weeks was suddenly assembled in the corner of her apartment. At first, Sophia resisted, stubbornly insisting she didn't need his help. But little by little, her walls began to crack. One evening, Ethan knocked on her door again, holding a bag of takeout from her favorite restaurant, the one they used to go to when things were good between them. She opened the door, narrowing her eyes. You don't have to keep doing this. I know, he said simply, handing her the bag. But I want to. Sophia sighed, stepping aside to let him in. For the first time in months, they sat together and shared a meal in the quiet of her tiny living room. It wasn't perfect. There were still unspoken words, lingering wounds. But it was a start. As Ethan looked at her, watching her laugh softly at a comment he made, he realized something. He didn't just want to be in the baby's life. He wanted to be in her life. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked gently, breaking the silence. Sophia put her fork down, her expression thoughtful. I was afraid, Ethan. Afraid of what you'd say, of how you'd react. I thought you'd see me as a burden. Ethan shook his head. You were never a burden, Sophia. I was too blind to see what I had right in front of me, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Sophia didn't respond, but for the first time, she didn't look away. Later that night, as Ethan walked back to his car, his phone buzzed. He glanced down to see an unknown number with a message that made his blood run cold. You think you can fix everything, but you don't know the full story yet. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his chest tightening. What the hell did that mean? He looked back towards Sophia's apartment, his protective instincts kicking in. Someone else was involved in this. Someone who knew more than they should. And whatever it was, Ethan wasn't going to let it hurt Sophia or their child. Ethan gripped his phone, staring at the cryptic message. You don't know the full story yet. It gnawed at him, an unwelcome reminder that things weren't as simple as they seemed. He glanced back at Sophia's apartment, the light in her window still glowing faintly. Who would send something like that? And why now? His instincts told him to dig deeper. The next morning, Ethan sat in his office, his laptop open, combing through every detail he could find about Sophia's life since the divorce. Her struggles, her work at the restaurant, even the bills he had seen stacking up. It all pointed to one thing. Sophia had been on her own. But if that were true, then who was sending him these threats? A knock on the door broke his focus. Jenna, his assistant, stepped in, a concerned look on her face. "Mr. Caldwell, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent." Ethan frowned. "Who is it?" She hesitated. "He wouldn't give me his name." Ethan's frustration spiked, but he nodded. "Send him in." A moment later, a man entered the office. He was tall, with sharp features and a confidence that immediately put Ethan on edge. The man sat without being invited, tossing a folder onto Ethan's desk. "You're Ethan Caldwell, right?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "A friend. Call me Nick." Ethan eyed him suspiciously before glancing at the folder. "What's this?" "Something you need to see," Nick replied. "It's about Sophia." Ethan's heart sank as he opened the folder. Inside were photos, grainy, black and white images of Sophia months ago, talking to a man outside a coffee shop. The man's face wasn't clear, but it was obvious they knew each other. "What is this supposed to prove?" Ethan snapped, pushing the folder back. Nick leaned forward, his tone lowering. "Sophia's not as innocent as you think, Mr. Caldwell. That man she's talking to? He's not just anyone. His name's Kyle Bennett, and he's trouble. Debt, fraud, you name it. Word is, he's been sniffing around Sophia for a while now." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Why are you telling me this?" Nick shrugged casually. "Let's just say I don't like seeing someone like you getting played. You've got resources. Use them." He stood, straightening his jacket. "You want the truth, Mr. Caldwell? Start with Kyle Bennett." Without another word, Nick turned and left, leaving Ethan staring at the photos. That evening, Ethan sat across from Sophia at her apartment. He had shown up unannounced again, this time with a folder in hand and a storm brewing in his eyes. "Who is Kyle Bennett?" he asked bluntly. Sophia froze, her expression shifting instantly. "What did you just say?" Ethan tossed the photos onto the table. "I'm not here to play games, Sophia. I want the truth. Who is he, and why is someone using him to threaten me?" Sophia's hands trembled as she picked up the photos, her face paling. "Where did you get these?" "That doesn't matter," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Is he connected to the baby? Are you in trouble?" "No," Sophia whispered, her voice cracking. "He has nothing to do with the baby." "Then who is he?" Sophia set the photos down, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "Kyle, he's from my past. After the divorce, I was desperate, Ethan. I trusted the wrong person. He said he'd help me, but he only made things worse." Ethan frowned. "How?" Sophia took a shaky breath. "Kyle loaned me money when I had nothing left. But he wasn't doing it out of kindness. He wanted control over my life, my choices. When I realized what he was really like, I cut ties with him, but he didn't take it well. He started following me, threatening me." Ethan's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you involved," she said softly. "You'd already moved on. I thought I could handle it myself." Ethan stood, his hands balled into fists. "He's not going to come near you again, Sophia. I'll make sure of it." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Ethan, don't. You don't understand the kind of man Kyle is." "I don't care," Ethan growled. "You and the baby are my responsibility now. I'm not letting anyone hurt you." As he stormed toward the door, Sophia called after him, her voice filled with panic. "Ethan, please don't do anything reckless." But Ethan wasn't listening. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that mattered, and he wasn't going to let anyone threaten what little was left of the family he had walked away from. Outside, Ethan climbed into his car and pulled out his phone. "Jenna," he said, his voice low, "find everything you can on a man named Kyle Bennett. I want to know where he lives, where he works, and what he's hiding." As the call ended, Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel. Whoever Kyle was, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Ethan couldn't shake Kyle's warning. The words replayed in his head like an ominous drumbeat. "You have no idea what's coming. He knew there was something deeper, something dangerous still hanging over Sophia's life, and now his own. The following evening, Ethan sat with Sophia in her apartment, the weight of unspoken fears filling the small room. Sophia looked tired, but calmer, her trust in Ethan slowly returning. "You don't have to fight my battles for me," she murmured as Ethan set down 2 mugs of tea. He met her gaze firmly. "I'm not fighting for you, Sophia. I'm fighting with you. And I'm not stopping until we're free of this." Sophia hesitated, then sighed. "There's something else you don't know." Ethan stilled, waiting. "When I left Kyle," she whispered, "he threatened to tell you I had lied about the baby. He said he'd twist the truth, make you believe the child wasn't yours. He wanted me to depend on him, and when I didn't, he got desperate." Ethan's jaw tightened, fury building inside him. "He used you." Sophia nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was scared, Ethan. I thought if I told you the truth, you'd never believe me. I thought I'd lose everything." Ethan stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. "Not anymore. He's not going to control you or this situation ever again." Before Sophia could stop him, Ethan stormed out. Ethan found Kyle exactly where he expected, at the same rundown bar where trouble always lurked. Ethan pushed through the doors, his anger boiling over. Kyle looked up, grinning smugly. Well, back for more, Caldwell?" Ethan strode over, towering above him. "You're done, Kyle. Done harassing Sophia. Done playing your sick games." Kyle smirked, leaning back lazily. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not scared of you, Caldwell. You think you can fix everything with your money, but I've got something you can't buy, leverage." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You don't have leverage. You have lies." Kyle chuckled, but before he could respond, Ethan slammed a thick envelope onto the table. "This is everything I have on you, Kyle. Fraud, debts, blackmail. You so much as breathe near Sophia again, and I'll make sure you rot in prison." Kyle's grin vanished. For the first time, Ethan saw fear flicker in his eyes. "You think you're untouchable," Ethan continued, his voice cold. "But I can bury you in ways you haven't even imagined. Stay away from her." Kyle glared at him, but he didn't speak. He knew Ethan wasn't bluffing. Ethan turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Days later, Sophia sat on the couch, her hands resting on her belly as Ethan placed a set of keys into her hand. "What's this?" she asked softly. "It's a new place," Ethan said, smiling faintly. "Bigger, safer, closer to good hospitals. You don't have to stay there if you don't want to. But I thought you'd like a fresh start." Sophia looked at the keys, tears filling her eyes. "Ethan, I know I messed up before," he continued, his voice steady, "but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophia nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I believe you." For the first time in months, the shadows of the past began to lift. The threats were gone, Kyle had disappeared, and in a few short weeks, their child would arrive, their second chance. Ethan looked at Sophia, the woman he had once let slip away, and made a silent vow to himself. He would never make that mistake again. No matter what the future held, they would face it together.